A legacy of honor is a heavy cloak to wear when the pockets are empty and the cold wind of ruin blows through the holes in one's shoes. England, 1826. The carriage was not the sort that usually graced the gravel drive of a ducal estate. It was a hired hackney, its black paint peeling like dead skin, smelling of damp straw and the stale tobacco of 1,000 previous occupants. Inside, Lady Clara Vane sat with a posture that defied the vehicle's violent shuddering as it navigated the rutted roads of the Suffolk coast. Outside the cracked window pane, the world was a study in grey. The sky was a bruised charcoal, heavy with unshed rain, hanging low over the flat, windswept marshes that separated the sea from the solid earth. This was a hard country, a place where the trees grew twisted by the salt gales, leaning away from the ocean as if trying to escape its relentless roar. Clara tightened her grip on the small, battered leather valise on her lap. Her knuckles were white, contrasting sharply with the faded blue silk of her gloves. She was 26 years of age, a time when most women of her station were managing nurseries or planning their third renovation of a country house. Clara, however, was managing a disaster. The death of her father, the Earl of Hatherley, had revealed that the family fortune was nothing more than a theatre set. Painted canvas hiding a hollow reality. He had been a charming man, her father, beloved by his club and his hounds, but he had possessed a fatal inability to distinguish between an investment and a gamble. He had left behind a title, a weeping widow, and a debt of £2,500 to a syndicate of London creditors who had no patience for nobility without liquidity. £2,500. The number was etched into Clara's mind like a scar. It was the price of her mother's safety. Lord Sterling, the family solicitor, had been blunt during their last meeting in his dusty, paper-clogged office. The creditors would wait 3 months. If the sum was not paid, the dower house, the only roof remaining over her sickly mother's head, would be seized, and the Countess of Hatherley would be cast out. The shame of it would kill her mother faster than any consumption. Clara had refused to weep. She had asked Sterling simply, "Where can I work?" And so she had come to Lowestoft Hall, not as a guest, not as a prospective bride, but as an employee. Lord Sterling had called in a favour with the young Duke, a man known for his obsession with efficiency. The position was unique, an archivist and estate ledger keeper. It was a role for a man, typically a steward with ink-stained cuffs, not an earl's daughter. But Clara had a gift that few knew of. While her sisters had practiced the harp, Clara had balanced her father's chaotic books in secret, trying to stem the bleeding of their fortune. She spoke the language of numbers better than she spoke the language of fans and flirtation. The carriage lurched violently, pulling Clara from her thoughts as the wheels crunched onto fresh gravel. Through the mist, Lowestoft Hall emerged. It was not a house. It was a fortress of limestone and glass, sprawling across the cliff edge like a sleeping beast. It possessed an aggressive grandeur, with rows of tall, unblinking windows and stone gargoyles that seemed to sneer at the approaching visitor. It was a place of immense power, the seat of the Trevelyan line, a family that had held this coast since the conquest. Clara felt a tremor of fear, cold and sharp, but she forced it down. She checked her reflection in the darkened glass. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot, though a few rebellious strands had escaped during the journey. Her eyes, green and intelligent, stared back with a determination she did not entirely feel. She smoothed the skirt of her gown, a navy wool that had been turned twice, and prepared to face the lion in his den. The hackney ground to a halt before the massive oak doors. There were no footmen rushing to assist her, no red carpet rolled out. After a long, humiliating minute, the great door creaked open and a figure emerged. It was the butler, a man named Henderson, who looked as though he had been carved from the same grey stone as the house. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the hired carriage with an expression of profound distaste. Clara opened the door herself, stepping down onto the gravel. The wind immediately tore at her cloak, whipping it around her legs. She walked up the steps, her chin held high, refusing to acknowledge the lack of welcome. "I am Lady Clara Vane," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the sound of the wind. His Grace is expecting me. Henderson bowed, a precise movement that conveyed the minimum amount of respect required by protocol. Indeed, my lady, though we did not expect you to arrive in such a manner. The Duke is in the library. He left instructions that you were to be brought to him immediately upon arrival. Then lead on, Clara said, stepping into the warmth of the hall. The interior of Lowestoft Hall was designed to intimidate. The entrance hall was a cavern of black and white marble, the ceiling vanishing into shadows 3 stories above. A grand staircase swept up one side, wide enough for a regiment of cavalry. Portraits of dead dukes lined the walls, men with hard eyes and heavy armor watching her intrusion. The air smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and the heavy metallic scent of ancient wealth. Clara felt small here, a temporary speck in a timeline of centuries, but she kept her pace steady as she followed Henderson's echoing footsteps. They passed through a long gallery and stopped before a set of double mahogany doors. Henderson knocked once, then opened them. Lady Clara Vane, Your Grace. The library was a masterpiece of masculine design. Walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, a massive fireplace roaring with logs the size of tree trunks. But Clara's eyes were drawn instantly to the center of the room. A massive desk, littered with maps, ledgers, and loose papers, dominated the space. Behind it stood Arthur Trevelyan, the Duke of Lowestoft. He was taller than she had imagined, a commanding figure even in his shirt sleeves. He had discarded his coat, and his white linen shirt was rolled up at the elbows, revealing forearms that spoke of strength rather than leisure. His hair was black, thick, and slightly unruly, as if he had been running his fingers through it in frustration. When he looked up, Clara felt the impact of his gaze like a physical touch. His eyes were a startling, intense blue, devoid of the boredom she usually saw in the aristocracy. They were the eyes of a hawk. Sharp, assessing, and utterly devoid of warmth. There were no scars on his face, only the hard lines of a man who took his responsibilities with deadly seriousness. "You are late," he said, his voice deep and resonant, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "The roads near the coast are treacherous, Your Grace," Clara replied, moving into the room but stopping a respectful distance from the desk. And the hired carriage was not built for speed. Arthur looked her over, his gaze taking in the faded dress, the practical hair, the lack of jewelry. He did not sneer, but he did not smile. He looked disappointed. "Lord Stirling assured me you had a mind for figures. He did not mention you were a decorator." "I am not a decorator, Your Grace," Clara said, her hackles rising. "I am here to work." "Work?" Arthur laughed, a short, humourless sound. He gestured to the chaos on his desk. "My previous steward was a fool who believed that handwriting was more important than arithmetic. I have spent the last 3 days trying to reconcile the yield of the northern barley fields with the drainage taxes demanded by the Crown. The numbers do not make sense. There is a deficit of £400 in the projection, and I cannot find the error." He pushed a heavy ledger toward her, almost as a challenge. It was a dismissal disguised as a test. He expected her to falter, to apologize for her gender and her station, and to retreat to a parlour to embroider. Clara stepped forward, ignoring the impropriety of approaching him so closely. She looked down at the open page. It was a mess of ink, columns of figures scrawled in a shaky hand. She studied the entries for the barley yield, then the tax calculations on the facing page. Her mind, honed by years of hiding her father's losses, shifted into a different gear. The numbers ceased to be ink on paper, they became a pattern. She traced the column with a gloved finger, her eyes narrowing. "Here," she said softly, pointing to the third entry from the bottom. "And here." Arthur leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers, smelling of sandalwood and ink. "What?" "Your steward applied the drainage tax to the gross yield before deducting the tenant tithes," Clara explained, her voice gaining strength. "But the Crown Law of 1824 states that drainage levies on reclaimed marshland are calculated on the net profit after tenant deductions. By taxing the gross, he inflated the liability by 18%. Furthermore, he carried the 7 over to the wrong decimal column in the subtotal." She did the calculation in her head, closing her eyes for a brief second. "The deficit isn't £400. You actually have a surplus of £52 and 10 shillings. She opened her eyes and looked up, finding Arthur staring at her. The skepticism in his blue eyes had vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He looked from her face to the ledger, grabbing a quill to scratch out the calculation himself. He worked furiously for a minute, silence filling the room save for the scratching of the nib. Then he stopped. £52, he muttered. And 10 shillings. He looked at her again, and this time, he really saw her. He saw the intelligence behind the green eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. You did that in your head. Necessity is an excellent teacher, Your Grace, Clara replied evenly. When one has very little money, one learns to count every penny with great precision. Arthur straightened, wiping ink from his thumb with a rag. The air in the room shifted. The hostility evaporated, replaced by a wary curiosity. Sterling was right. You are not what I expected, Lady Clara. Most women of your rank would faint at the sight of a tax ledger. Most women of my rank do not have a mother who risks losing her home in 90 days, Clara said, her voice low. I cannot afford to faint. I can only afford to be correct. Arthur held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. Very well. The position is yours. The archives are in the East Gallery, but the current accounts are here. You will work in this room, at the desk by the window. I expect a full audit of the tenant rolls by the end of the week. You shall have it, Clara promised. Henderson will show you to your room, Arthur said, turning back to his maps, dismissing her as quickly as he had engaged her. But as she turned to leave, he added, And Lady Clara. Thank you. Clara nodded and exited the library, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had passed the test. She had survived the lion. But as she stepped back into the grand hall, she found a viper waiting. Standing at the foot of the stairs was a woman who could only be Lady Augusta, the Dowager Duchess of Lowestoft. She was a woman of perhaps 60, but she fought the years with a rigid, terrifying elegance. She wore a gown of heavy grey silk that rustled like dry leaves, and diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, hard and cold as ice. Her face was a mask of powdered disdain, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Clara curtsied, low and respectful. Your Grace. Augusta did not return the gesture. She stared at Clara as if she were a muddy footprint on a pristine carpet. So, the Dowager said, her voice high and imperious. This is the Hatherley girl. You are thinner than I recall. And your dress? Well, I suppose poverty has its own uniform. Clara rose, meeting the older woman's gaze. I am here to assist the Duke with the estate management, Your Grace. Management, Augusta scoffed, walking a slow circle around Clara. A euphemism for charity, I suspect. My son has a weakness for strays. He believes he is doing your father's memory a kindness. But let us be clear, Lady Clara. You are not a guest in this house. You are a hireling, a paid labourer with a title that has lost all its currency. I am aware of my position, Clara said, keeping her voice neutral despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Are you? Augusta stopped in front of her, her eyes narrowing. Then you will understand that you do not belong in the family wing. The West Wing is reserved for proper guests. Henderson, she snapped at the butler, who hovered nervously nearby. Have Lady Clara's things taken to the attic rooms in the servants' corridor. The room next to the linen closet will suffice. It is warm enough, and she will be closer to the kitchens, where she can take her meals. Clara felt the insult like a slap. To be relegated to the servants' quarters was a declaration of social death. It was Augusta's way of stripping her of her last shred of dignity, of marking her as less than. Your Grace, Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. I am the daughter of an Earl. Surely, you are the daughter of a bankrupt fool, Augusta hissed, her veneer of politeness cracking. Do not presume to speak to me of rank when you have come to my house to beg for wages. You will sleep where I tell you, and you will be grateful for the roof. Do not think that batting those green eyes at my son will elevate you. To him, you are a calculator. To me, you are a nuisance. Is there a problem here? The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Arthur stood in the doorway of the library, his presence instantly commanding the space. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, and his brow was furrowed in irritation. Augusta turned, her smile returning instantly, though it did not reach her eyes. "No problem, Arthur. I was merely instructing Henderson on where to lodge Lady Clara. Given her unique status, I felt the attic rooms would be most appropriate. It would save the maids the trouble of heating the guest suites." Arthur looked from his mother to Clara. He saw the flush of humiliation on Clara's pale cheeks, the way she held her head high, despite the degradation being heaped upon her. He looked back at his mother, and his expression hardened into stone. "Lady Clara is here at my request, mother," Arthur said, his voice quiet but deadly. "She is performing a service vital to the survival of this estate. A service, I might add, that no one else in this house seems capable of performing. She is not a scullery maid." "She is hardly a duchess, Arthur," Augusta replied, her voice tightening. Propriety dictates that we treat the daughter of an earl with the respect due her birth," Arthur interrupted, stepping forward. "Henderson, take Lady Clara's bags to the blue room in the west wing. Have a fire lit immediately, and ensure she has everything she requires." The blue room, one of the finest guest suites. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the invisible servants listening in the shadows. Augusta went rigid, her face draining of colour. "You undermine me in front of the staff," she whispered, her hands clenching at her sides. "I am the Duke of Lowestoft," Arthur said simply. "I decide who sleeps under my roof and in which bed. Do not countermand my orders again, mother." He turned to Clara, his face softening only fractionally. "Go and rest, Lady Clara. We have much work to do tomorrow." Clara curtsied again, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and a new, different kind of fear. She had won the battle, but she had undoubtedly started a war. "Thank you, Your Grace." She followed Henderson up the grand staircase, feeling Augusta's gaze burning into her back like a brand. She knew, with absolute certainty, that the Dowager Duchess would never forgive this public slight. By elevating Clara, Arthur had placed a target on her back. The blue room was exquisite, draped in sapphire velvet and cream silk, with a window that overlooked the churning grey sea. But Clara could not rest. The adrenaline of the encounter coursed through her veins. After a meagre dinner brought on a tray, she found herself pacing the plush carpet. The image of the ledger in the library haunted her. The error Arthur had shown her was simple, almost childish. But Arthur Trevelyan was not a simple man, and his previous steward had been employed for 20 years. Driven by an instinct she couldn't suppress, Clara grabbed her shawl and slipped out of her room. The house was silent, the corridors shadowed and ghostly. She made her way back down to the library, her soft shoes making no sound on the stone. The door was unlocked. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Clara lit a single candle and sat at the desk. She didn't look at the tax records this time. She pulled a different book from the stack, the expense journal for the last 5 years. She opened it to the middle, her eyes scanning the columns of neat script. At first, it looked normal. Grain, livestock, repairs. But as she turned the pages, a pattern began to emerge. It was subtle, buried in the minutiae. Small sums, listed under vague headings like structural maintenance, West Ridge, or dike repair, Sector 4. £5 here, £10 there. But they were frequent, weekly. Clara frowned. She remembered looking at the estate map earlier. West Ridge was a desolate crag of granite. There were no structures there to maintain. And Sector 4 of the dike system had been abandoned to the sea 10 years ago. She dipped a quill and began to tally the sums on a scrap of paper. £10, 20, 50. Over the course of a single year, the amount swelled to hundreds. Over 5 years. Clara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The total was staggering. Thousands of pounds were bleeding out of the Trevelyan estate, vanishing into thin air under the guise of repairs that could not possibly exist. This wasn't incompetence. The steward hadn't been a fool who didn't know how to calculate tax. He had been a thief. Or he had been covering for one. She looked at the handwriting of the authorizations next to the expenses. It wasn't the steward's hand. It was a spidery, elegant script, signed with initials that were not Arthur's. Clara looked up into the darkness of the library, the candle flame dancing in her green eyes. She had come here to save her mother from debt, but she had stumbled into a crime scene. Someone was stealing a fortune from the Duke of Lowestoft, and based on the hostility she had faced in the hall, she had a terrifying suspicion of who it might be. She closed the book, her hands trembling. The ledger was no longer just a book of numbers. It was a weapon, and she was the only one who knew how to fire it. The weeks at Lowestoft Hall passed not in hours, but in the slow, rhythmic turning of pages and the scratching of quills. Outside the high windows of the library, the Suffolk autumn deepened, turning the marshes into a tapestry of russet and gold, while the North Sea churned with an ever-increasing violence against the cliffs. Inside, however, a different kind of season was taking hold, a season of quiet industry and an unlikely fragile partnership that bloomed amidst the dust of centuries. Lady Clara Vane had become a fixture in the East Wing. Her initial reception by the household staff, coloured by the Dowager Duchess's disdain, had slowly thawed into a grudging respect. They saw her light burning late into the night. They saw the dark circles under her eyes and the ink stains on her fingers that she scrubbed raw before every meal. She was not a guest playing at estate management. She was a woman labouring as hard as any ploughman in the fields, driven by a desperation they could sense but not name. For Clara, the library had transformed from a place of employment into a sanctuary. It was the only room in the vast, echoing mansion where she felt safe from Lady Augusta's predatory gaze. The Dowager Duchess watched her like a hawk circling a field mouse, her comments at dinner always laced with poison, subtle critiques of Clara's twice-mended gowns, or pointed questions about when she intended to return to her quaint little cottage. Clara absorbed these blows with a stoicism that hid the trembling of her hands, channeling her anxiety into the work. She had to. The debt of £2,500 was a clock ticking down in her mind, loud and relentless. But it was her time with Arthur Trevelyan that defined these days. The Duke was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, yet in the quiet confinement of the library, the walls he had built around himself began to lower, brick by brick. They worked side by side at the great mahogany desk, often until the candles burned low in their sconces. One particularly blustery Tuesday, Arthur laid a large hand-drawn map of the southern tenant farms between them. The parchment was old, cracking at the edges, covered in the fading ink of his grandfather's time. "The yields in the lower valley have been stagnant for a decade," Arthur murmured, tracing the line of a river with a finger that was calloused from riding. "My overseer suggests we increase the rent to cover the cost of new seed, but the tenants are already stretched thin. If I push them, they will break. If I do nothing, the land becomes a burden rather than an asset." Clara studied the map, her mind overlaying the figures she had memorized from the ledgers onto the geography before her. She saw the problem not as a matter of coin, but of flow. "It is not a question of seed, Your Grace," she said softly. "It is a question of water. Look here." She pointed to a cluster of farms near the bend of the river. The drainage tax records show that these 3 farms pay a premium for flood protection, yet their harvest reports consistently mention rot in the root vegetables. The ground is waterlogged. The old sluice gates built in 1790 are likely failing. If you increase the rent for seed, you are merely planting gold in mud. It will rot just the same. Arthur looked at where she pointed, then back at her face. The intense blue of his eyes softened, replaced by a look of genuine consideration. "You suggest we divert the capital intended for the seed into infrastructure?" "I suggest you repair the gates," Clara replied firmly. "It will cost £300 up front, which will hurt the quarterly balance. But dry land yields 30% more crop. You will recoup the investment in 2 seasons, and your tenants will not starve in the winter. You save the land and you save the men." Arthur was silent for a long moment. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. It was a look that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. A look of recognition. He was seeing her not as a bankrupt Earl's daughter, but as an intellectual equal, a mind that sharpened his own. "You have a way of cutting through the noise to find the heart of the matter, Lady Clara," he said quietly. My council of advisors debated this for 3 hours last week and concluded we should evict the tenants and graze sheep. Your solution is humane and logical. Logic and humanity need not be enemies, Your Grace, she answered, lowering her eyes to the map to hide the flush rising in her cheeks. Arthur, he corrected gently. In this room, when it is just the work and the truth, titles seem a heavy burden. You may call me Arthur. Foe. The use of his Christian name hung in the air, charged and dangerous. It was an intimacy that defied every rule of their society. A duke did not invite a paid employee to use his given name. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the map, terrified that if she looked up, he would see the hope that had foolishly begun to take root in her chest. A hope that was far more dangerous than any debt. I should check the lumber estimates for the repairs then, she stammered, retreating into the safety of formalities. But as the days turned into weeks, the evidence of their success began to mount. The repairs were authorized, the ledgers were balanced, and for the first time in years, the Lowestoft estate was operating with a clarity that Arthur had craved. Yet beneath the surface of this professional triumph, a dark undercurrent was pulling Clara toward a rocky shore. The anomaly she had discovered on her first night, the payments to Westridge, had not vanished. It had grown. Every time she opened the expense journals, the entries mocked her. Repair of north wall, purchase of slate, labour for fencing, all directed toward a barren stretch of moorland where no wall stood and no fence was needed. The sums were transferred via bank draft to a Mr. Frederick Vance in London. Clara knew she could not ignore it. Her conscience, honed by the shame of her father's financial lies, would not permit her to be an accomplice to theft, even by silence. She spent 3 nights in the dusty archives of the East Gallery, hunting for the name. She found it in a box of old correspondence belonging to the late Duke. Frederick Vance was a second cousin to Lady Augusta, a man described in old letters as a charming wastrel and a liability at the card table. The picture formed in Clara's mind was complete and devastating. Lady Augusta was siphoning thousands of pounds from her son's estate to support a dissolute relative, disguising the theft as maintenance for the very lands Arthur was trying so desperately to save. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, striking at the very core of Arthur's efforts to be a good lord to his people. The night she decided to speak was a night of howling wind. The rain lashed against the library windows, sealing them into a world of firelight and shadows. Arthur was in high spirits, a rare occurrence. He had just returned from the lower valley, where the new drainage ditches were already drawing water away from the fields. "It is working, Clara," he said as he entered, shaking the rain from his heavy coat. His hair was damp and curled slightly at his collar, making him look younger, less burdened. "The water level has dropped by 6 inches. Old man Miller actually smiled at me. I think we have turned the tide." He walked to the drinks cabinet and poured 2 small glasses of sherry, bringing one to her desk. "To logic," he said, raising his glass with a rare, devastating smile. Clara looked at the amber liquid, her stomach churning with nausea. She could not drink to his victory when she was holding the knife that would cut him. She set her quill down, her hand trembling. "I cannot drink with you, Your Grace," she whispered. Arthur's smile faded instantly. He lowered his glass, his eyes narrowing with concern. "What is it? Has my mother said something to you? If she has—" "It is not what she has said," Clara interrupted, standing up. She felt small and fragile before him, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "It is what she has done." She reached into her drawer and pulled out the black ledger, the one containing the last 5 years of capital expenses. She opened it to the page she had marked with a strip of blue ribbon. "You asked me to find the truth in the numbers," she said, her voice shaking. "I have found it. But it is a truth that will bring you no joy." Arthur set his glass down on the desk with a sharp clink. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the mask of the Duke. "Explain." "For the last 5 years, there have been weekly withdrawals from the estate accounts," Clara began, pointing to the columns. "They are listed as maintenance for Westridge, Sector 4, and the old granary. I have ridden past all 3 locations. Westridge is bare rock. Sector 4 is underwater. The old granary burned down 10 years ago." Arthur leaned over the book, his body rigid. I know the granary is gone. Why are there payments for it? Because the money is not buying timber or stone, Clara said, pushing a second document toward him, a bank draft tracer she had requested from the village clerk. The funds are being wired to a private account in London held by a Mr. Frederick Vance. The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. He recoiled, his face draining of colour. Vance? My mother's cousin? The man is a leech. He has been banned from every club in St. James. The total amount over 5 years exceeds £12,000, Clara said, the number hanging in the air like a sentence of doom. The authorizations for these payments, they are not signed by your steward. They are initialed by the person who holds the power of attorney for household expenses. She did not need to say the name. Arthur knew. He stared at the initials in the margin, a sharp, angular A.T., Augusta Trevelyan. The silence that followed was terrifying. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, but in the library, the world seemed to have stopped. Arthur stared at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. His mother, the woman who preached incessantly about the honour of the Trevelyan name, who looked down on Clara for her poverty, who claimed to be the guardian of the family's dignity. She was a thief. She was stealing from her own son, from the tenants she claimed to rule, to fund the gambling habits of a worthless relative. £12,000, Arthur whispered, his voice sounding as if it had been ground through gravel. That money could have rebuilt the entire village. It could have saved the Miller farm 3 years ago. He looked up at Clara. His eyes were no longer blue fire. They were shards of ice. You are certain? The numbers do not lie, Arthur, she said softly, using his name again in her distress. I wish they did. Arthur closed the ledger with a slam that echoed like a gunshot. He did not yell. He did not throw the glass. He went deadly still, a reaction that was far more frightening. He walked to the window and stared out into the darkness, his hands clasped behind his back, the knuckles white. She speaks of duty, he said to the reflection in the glass. She speaks of blood, and all the while she bleeds us dry. He turned back to Clara. You have done a brave thing, telling me this. A lesser woman would have used this knowledge for leverage. You could have blackmailed her. God knows she has given you cause to hate her. I am not her, Clara said simply, and I work for you. Arthur crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped before her, and for a moment, Clara thought he might touch her. His hand raised, hovering near her shoulder, before falling back to his side. I must deal with this. Tonight. Arthur, be careful, Clara urged. She is proud. Shame makes people dangerous. She should be ashamed, he replied coldly. Wait here. He took the ledger and marched out of the library. Clara sank into her chair, her legs giving way. She wrapped her arms around herself, listening to the heavy tread of his boots fading down the corridor toward the dowager's private apartments. She did not hear the conversation that followed, but she felt the tremors of it through the very stones of the house. The confrontation in Lady Augusta's sitting room was not a shouting match, it was an execution of power. Arthur Trevelyan threw the ledger onto his mother's tea table, shattering a porcelain cup. He did not ask for explanations. He stated facts. He told her that Frederick Vance was cut off effective immediately. He told her that her access to the estate accounts was revoked. He told her that she would repay every penny, even if he had to sell her personal jewellery to do it. And then, he left her. Back in the library, Clara waited. An hour passed, then 2. When Arthur finally returned, he looked years older. The vitality he had shown earlier regarding the drainage ditches was gone, replaced by a weary hardness. It is done, he said, sinking into his chair. She did not deny it. She claimed it was her right, that the estate owed her family support. She called me a miser. He rubbed his temples. I have restricted her allowance. She is displeased. I am sorry, Clara said. Do not be. Arthur looked at her, and there was a fierce intensity in his gaze. You saved this house, Clara. Again, I am in your debt. But Clara knew with a chilling certainty that while she had saved the house, she had likely doomed herself. The next morning, the atmosphere in Lowestoft Hall was suffocating. The servants moved like ghosts, sensing the violent shift in the tectonic plates of the family power structure. Lady Augusta did not appear for breakfast. She remained in her rooms, claiming a migraine. Clara attempted to focus on her work, but she felt a gaze on her back. When she went to the dining hall for a midday meal, still taken alone, as per protocol, she passed Augusta on the stairs. The Dowager Duchess did not look like a woman defeated. She looked like a viper that had been stepped on but not killed. Her face was pale, her lips painted a severe red, and her eyes were filled with a hatred so pure, so distilled, that Clara actually stumbled on the step. Augusta stopped. She leaned in close, her voice a whisper of silk and steel. "You think you have won, little accountant. You think because you showed him a book, you have taken my place." "I have taken no one's place, your grace," Clara replied, gripping the banister. "I merely did my job." "Your job," Augusta sneered. "Your job was to be invisible. Instead, you have turned my son against his own blood. You have embarrassed me. You have cut off my family." She reached out and brushed a piece of lint from Clara's shoulder, a gesture that felt like a threat. "Arthur is a man of rigid morals, Lady Clara. He tolerates you because he believes you are useful and honest. But everyone has a breaking point. Everyone has a secret. And if they don't, well, secrets can be created." "I have nothing to hide," Clara said, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "We shall see." Augusta smiled, and it was the smile of a skull. "Enjoy your triumph while it lasts, my dear. But remember, this is my house. I know every shadow, every lock, and every weakness. You are merely a guest who has overstayed her welcome." Augusta swept past her, descending the stairs with the regal air of a queen marching to war. Clara stood frozen, the cold from the stones seeping into her soles. She realized then that the audit was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the opening shot. By exposing Augusta's theft, Clara had humiliated a woman who valued pride above all else. She returned to the library, but the numbers on the page blurred. She looked at the door, half expecting it to burst open. She thought of the debt, £2,500. She thought of her mother. She had risked everything to be honest, and now she was alone in a house with a powerful enemy who had just declared her intent to destroy her. That evening, Arthur was distant, consumed by the legal paperwork required to formally sever Vance from the estate. He barely spoke to Clara, his mind clearly occupied by the pain of his mother's betrayal. He did not see the danger Clara was in. He assumed that by removing his mother's financial power, he had rendered her harmless. He did not understand that a woman like Augusta, stripped of her coin, would turn to a currency that was far more volatile: reputation. As Clara blew out her candle that night, the darkness of the blue room felt heavy and oppressive. The wind howled outside, sounding like voices whispering in the eaves. She pulled the covers up to her chin, but she could not get warm. The safety of the library was an illusion. She was in the lion's den, and while the lion might be noble, the lioness was hungry for blood. Clara closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, she saw Augusta's eyes, cold, calculating, and promising a retribution that no ledger could balance. The math was simple. For Augusta to regain her power, Clara Vane had to be subtracted from the equation, permanently. And in the dark, silent corridors of Lowestoft Hall, the plans for that subtraction were already being drawn. The silence that descended upon Lowestoft Hall in the days following the audit was not the peaceful silence of a library, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a battlefield before the first cannon fires. Lady Clara Vane moved through the corridors like a ghost in her own life, acutely aware that she had struck a blow against a woman who did not know the meaning of surrender. Lady Augusta had retreated to her chambers, feigning illness, but the air in the house crackled with an unspoken threat. Every servant's glance seemed weighted with suspicion. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep approaching to deliver retribution. Clara continued her work in the library, but her concentration was fractured. She found herself checking the lock on the door, her eyes darting to the shadows as the early winter dusk settled over the Suffolk coast. Arthur, for his part, was a man consumed by the grim necessity of untangling his estate from his mother's deceit. He spent his days riding between the tenant farms and the village solicitor, legal papers tucked into his saddlebags, his face set in a grim line of determination. He spoke little to Clara, though his silence was not born of anger, but of a deep, weary shame. He was a duke who prided himself on order and honour, and to have found rot at the very heart of his family tree had shaken him to his core. He treated Clara with a formal, distant courtesy that hurt more than his previous scepticism. It was as if he were trying to protect her by keeping her at arm's length, unaware that the distance only left her more exposed to the predator lurking in the east wing. The blow came 3 nights later, on an evening when the wind from the North Sea was howling around the stone corners of the hall like a banshee. Dinner had been a sombre affair, served in the vast, echoing dining room where the candlelight struggled to push back the gloom. Lady Augusta had made a miraculous recovery, descending the grand staircase in a gown of stiff black velvet, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She sat at the foot of the table, her eyes dry and bright, watching Arthur with a terrifying composure. She did not speak to Clara, who sat midway down the table, but her presence was a physical weight, pressing down on the room. It was just as the footmen were clearing the final course that Augusta let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. Her hand flew to her head, her fingers frantically searching the intricate coils of her silver hair. "My sapphires!" she whispered, her voice trembling with a perfectly calibrated note of panic. "The Trevelyan sapphires. I intended to have them cleaned for the winter ball. I placed the box on my vanity not an hour ago. They are gone." Arthur looked up from his wine, his brow furrowing. "Are you certain, mother? Perhaps you misplaced them in your dressing room." "I am not senile, Arthur," Augusta snapped, rising to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "The box is there, but it is empty. The tiara is gone, an heirloom that has been in this family for 4 generations, stolen. Under this very roof." Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She looked at Augusta and saw a flicker of triumph in the older woman's eyes. A brief predatory flash before the mask of distress slipped back into place. "Henderson!" Arthur's voice boomed, summoning the butler from the shadows. "Seal the exits. No one leaves the house. I want a search of the servants' quarters immediately." "Not just the servants' quarters, Arthur," Augusta interjected, her voice smooth as silk. "If we are to be thorough, we must search every room, every guest room. We cannot afford to be sentimental when the legacy of your grandmother is at stake." Arthur looked at his mother, then at Clara. A shadow of hesitation crossed his face, but the logic of the situation and the law of the land bound him. A theft of this magnitude required a total investigation. To exempt anyone would be to compromise his authority as a magistrate. "Very well," Arthur said, his voice flat. "Search the house, start with the east wing, and move west." Clara remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap to stop them from shaking. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, where the search would end. She watched as Henderson and a team of maids moved through the house, the sounds of doors opening and drawers being pulled echoing down the hallway. It took an hour of agonizing waiting while Augusta paced the room, lamenting the loss of her precious treasures and casting side glances at Clara that were sharp enough to draw blood. Finally, Henderson returned. He was pale, his usual professional mask crumbling. In his hands, he carried a bundle of dark velvet. Behind him walked 2 maids, one of them, a girl named Betty, weeping softly into her apron. "Your Grace," Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper. He did not look at Clara. He walked straight to the head of the table and placed the bundle before the Duke. Arthur reached out and unfolded the velvet. The light from the chandelier caught the deep, oceanic blue of the stones, the Trevelyan sapphires. They lay there, glittering with a cold, accusing beauty. "Where were they found?" Arthur asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "In the blue room, Your Grace," Henderson replied, staring at the floor. "Hidden beneath the mattress of the bed, along with this." He placed a piece of paper on the table next to the tiara. It was a document, folded and creased. Arthur picked up the paper. As he read it, the colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a statue of marble. He read it once, then twice, his hand tightening on the parchment until the knuckles turned white. He looked up, and his eyes found Clara. The connection between them, usually electric with intellectual understanding, severed with a brutal snap. "Clara," he said. It was not a question. It was a summons. Clara stood, her legs feeling like lead. She walked to the head of the table, ignoring Augusta's smirk. She looked down at the paper in Arthur's hand. It was a pawn receipt. A receipt from a broker in London, dated 3 days prior. It detailed an agreement to exchange one sapphire tiara of noble provenance for the sum of £2,500, the exact amount of her father's debt. And at the bottom, signed with a flourish, was the name of Lord Stirling, her family solicitor. £2,500, Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. That is the sum you owe, is it not? The sum that will save your mother from the street. Arthur, please, Augusta said, stepping forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We must not be too harsh. The girl is desperate. She comes from bad blood. Her father was a gambler. It is only natural that she would resort to creative measures to pay his debts. She likely thought she could replace it before we noticed. I did not take it, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with a clarity that cut through the room. She looked Arthur in the eye. I have not left this estate in weeks. I have been in the library every day. How could I have pawned a tiara in London 3 days ago? The receipt suggests you had an accomplice, Augusta countered smoothly. Your lawyer, perhaps, or a courier. You are a clever woman, Lady Clara. You managed to hide my cousin's embezzlement for weeks before deciding to use it for your own advancement. Who is to say you did not plan this as well? I exposed the embezzlement to save the estate, Clara cried, her composure fraying. Why would I steal from the very man I am trying to help? Because you need the money, Arthur said. He held up the receipt. This motive is perfect, Clara. Too perfect. You have the access, you have the desperate need, and now we have the evidence found in your bed. It was planted, Clara insisted, turning to face him fully. Don't you see? It is a trap. Your mother knew exactly when the sapphires went missing because she took them. How dare you? Augusta shrieked, clutching her chest. Arthur, she accuses me of stealing my own jewellery. This is madness. She is deranged by guilt. You must send for the constable. She must be removed at once. Arthur looked at the tiara, then at his mother, and finally at Clara. He was a man of logic, and the logic of the scene was damning. The physical evidence was overwhelming. But as he looked at Clara, at the defiance in her green eyes, the straight line of her spine, something in him rebelled against the conclusion. Let me see the receipt, Clara demanded. She did not wait for permission. She reached out and took the paper from Arthur's hand. Clara, Arthur warned, if you are going to hang me, Your Grace, at least let me see the rope, she snapped. She brought the paper close to the candlelight, her eyes scanning the ink, the date, the signature. It was a masterful forgery. The handwriting was a near-perfect imitation of Stirling's cramped script. But Clara Vane was not a woman who looked at the surface of things. She looked at the details. Her eyes fell on the red wax seal pressed next to the signature. It was the crest of the Stirling firm. A rose entwined with a scale. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at Arthur, and for the first time that night, a spark of hope returned to her eyes. This is a forgery, she stated flatly. It is signed by your lawyer, Arthur said wearily. It is signed with his name, but not his seal, Clara corrected. She placed the paper back on the table and pointed to the red wax. Look closely, Arthur. You are a man who notices details. Look at the rose. Arthur leaned in, his eyes narrowing. It is the Stirling crest. It is the old Stirling crest, Clara said, her voice gaining strength. 3 months ago, Lord Stirling dropped his signet ring on a stone hearth. The emerald set into the centre cracked, and the brass rim was dented. He had a new ring cast immediately, but the artisan made a mistake. The new seal has a tiny, distinct nick on the left petal of the rose. He complained about it in his last letter to me. She looked at Augusta, whose face had gone rigid. This seal is perfect. It has no nick. It was made with the old ring, or a mould taken from an old impression found in my father's papers. Lord Stirling has not used a flawless seal in 12 weeks. This receipt is dated 3 days ago. It is impossible. Arthur stared at the wax. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small magnifying glass he used for inspecting maps. He bent over the table, the room holding its breath. He examined the red blob of wax with a forensic intensity. The rose was indeed smooth, the petals unbroken. "You have a letter from him?" Arthur asked, not looking up. "In the library," Clara said. "In the top drawer of my desk. A correspondence regarding the Dower House, received last week. Compare them." Arthur straightened. "Henderson, fetch the letter." The butler scurried away, the sound of his footsteps the only noise in the oppressive silence. Augusta stood frozen, her hand gripping the back of her chair so hard her knuckles were yellow. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to dismiss the claim as a desperate lie. But Arthur held up a hand to silence her. "Not a word," he said, his voice cold. "We wait for the evidence." When Henderson returned, Arthur took the letter. He placed it beside the receipt. He looked through the glass again. He compared the two seals. The difference was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye of a layman. But to a man who spent his life studying crop blights and map coordinates, it was a canyon. The seal on the letter had a clear, sharp indentation on the left petal. The seal on the receipt was smooth. Arthur stood up slowly. He looked at the receipt, then at the tiara, and finally at his mother. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The receipt was a forgery. The theft was a frame-up. And the only person with access to the old Hatherley papers, the only person with the vindictiveness to orchestrate such a theatre, stood at the foot of the table. But Arthur was also a magistrate. He was the law in Suffolk, and the law required more than a difference in wax to acquit a woman found with stolen goods in her bed. He could not simply declare her innocent based on his own observation of a seal, without verifying it with Stirling himself. If he dismissed the charges now, his mother would spread the story that he was bewitched by a thief, destroying his authority and Clara's reputation forever. He needed Stirling's testimony. He needed absolute, irrefutable proof that would stand up in a court of peers. "The seal is inconsistent," Arthur said finally, his voice sounding hollow. "Inconsistent?" Clara asked, disbelief colouring her tone. "It is proof, Arthur. Proof that I did not do this." "It is a strong indicator, Clara, but it is not legal proof," Arthur said, his face closing off again, retreating behind the mask of duty. "I cannot ignore the fact that the jewels were found in your room. The law is specific. Until Lord Stirling can be summoned to testify regarding his seal and this signature, the charge stands." "You cannot be serious," Clara whispered. "You see the truth. I know you see it." "I see a discrepancy," Arthur corrected, though his eyes begged her to understand the position he was in. "I must send a rider to London to fetch Stirling. It will take 3 days, perhaps 4 in this weather." "And until then?" Augusta demanded, sensing an opening. "She must be taken to the village jail. She is a flight risk." "No," Arthur said sharply. "She is a lady of the realm, and this house is under my jurisdiction. She will not go to the jail." "Then where?" Augusta sneered. "The dungeon." "The library," Arthur said. "It is secure. The windows are barred against the storm. She will be confined there, under guard, until Stirling arrives. No one is to speak to her. No one is to enter." "You are making a mistake, Arthur," Augusta warned, her voice low. "You are coddling a criminal." "I am securing a suspect," Arthur replied. He turned to Clara. "Lady Clara, you will go with Henderson to the library. You will remain there until this matter is resolved." Clara looked at him, searching for the man who had worked beside her for weeks, the man who had smiled at her over a map of drainage ditches. He was gone. In his place was the Duke of Lowestoft, a man who chose the safety of procedure over the risk of faith. "You call this justice, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "You see the lie, yet you lock me away to protect the liar." "I am protecting the truth," Arthur said, though he could not meet her eyes. "Go." Clara turned and walked out of the dining room. She did not look back at Augusta, whose face was a mask of fury that her plan had stalled. She walked with her head high, flanked by Henderson and the footman, but inside she was shattering. She had believed, foolishly, that Arthur's respect for her mind would translate into trust in her character. She had believed that they were partners, but in the end, she was just a suspect, and he was just a duke. The library door clicked shut behind her, the heavy lock turning with a sound of finality. Clara stood in the center of the room, the darkness pressing in. The fire in the grate was dead, the ashes cold. She walked to the desk where they had solved the problems of the estate together, and ran her hand over the leather surface. She was a prisoner in the sanctuary she had built. But as the initial wave of despair receded, the cold clarity of her intellect returned. She thought of the seal. She thought of Augusta's face when the discrepancy was pointed out. Augusta was frightened. The plan had been for Clara to be dragged away in hysteria, disgraced immediately. The delay was dangerous for the dowager. Clara sat down at the desk and lit a single candle. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She could not leave the room, but she could prepare. When Sterling arrived, she would need to be ready to present a case, not just for her innocence, but for Augusta's guilt. She would document everything, the timeline, the seal, the access to her room. However, a chilling thought occurred to her. Augusta knew that Sterling's arrival would doom her. Augusta knew that the seal would be proven false. The Dowager Duchess would not sit idly by for 3 days waiting for her own destruction. She would act. She would find a way to remove Clara before the lawyer ever set foot in Suffolk. Clara looked at the barred windows, where the rain lashed against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. She was safe from the storm outside, but she was trapped with the monster inside. Arthur had locked her in for her protection, but in doing so, he had left her sitting in a cage, waiting for the predator to make the next move. And Clara knew, with the instinct of a woman who had survived ruin once before, that the move would come soon, and it would not be a legal one. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and dipped her quill into the ink. She would write her defense. She would use the logic Arthur prized so highly to save herself. But as she wrote, a tear escaped and fell onto the parchment, blotting the ink. It was not a tear of fear, but of grief, for she realized that even if she proved her innocence, something precious had been broken tonight. The bridge they had built between their worlds had collapsed under the weight of a single false receipt. Arthur had hesitated, and in that hesitation, he had shown her that she was still, and perhaps would always be, the outsider looking in. The hours ticked by, marked only by the grandfather clock in the corner. Midnight came and went. The house settled into a silence that was even more ominous than before. Clara did not sleep. She watched the door handle, waiting. She knew Augusta would not let the sun rise on a stalemate. The game was reaching its end, and Clara Vane intended to be awake when the final piece was played. The library of Lowestoft Hall, once a sanctuary of intellect and shared purpose, had transformed into a cage of gilded wood and cold silence. Lady Clara Vane sat by the dying embers of the fire, the shadows stretching across the room like the bars of a prison cell. Outside, the storm that had been threatening the coast for days had finally unleashed its full fury. The wind battered the stone walls with a violence that shook the window panes in their lead frames, and the rain lashed against the glass in relentless driving sheets. It was a night fit for chaos, a night where the natural world seemed to mirror the turmoil within the ducal estate. Clara's hands were stained with ink, not from the estate ledgers this time, but from the frantic notes she had been compiling for her defense. She had listed every inconsistency in the theft accusation, the timeline of her movements, the impossibility of the pawn receipt's date, and, most damning of all, the microscopic flaw in Lord Sterling's seal. She had built a fortress of logic on paper, but as the hours ticked by, a creeping dread settled in her stomach. Logic was a weapon for the courtroom, But she was not in a court. She was in the house of a woman who regarded power as the only law that mattered. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour of 10, the sound heavy and mournful. Just as the final note faded, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm, a frantic, clanging peal. It was the estate bell, the massive iron alarm mounted above the stable block, used only in times of dire emergency. Clara rushed to the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. Through the driving rain and the pitch-black darkness, she saw it, a sullen orange glow rising in the distance to the west. It was not the warm light of a hearth, but the jagged, hungry flicker of uncontrolled flame. The home farm, the heart of the estate's grain storage, located a mile from the main house, was burning. The corridor outside the library erupted into noise. Heavy boots pounded against the marble floor, shouts echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and the distinctive, authoritative voice of the Duke cut through the confusion. "Rally the men! Get the water pumps from the Carriage house! Every able-bodied man to the western embankment immediately!" The key turned in the library lock with a sharp click. The door swung open, and Arthur stood there. He was already in his riding coat, his hair wild from the wind he had briefly faced, his face grim and illuminated by the lantern he held. He looked at Clara, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the magistrate slipped, revealing the terrified man beneath. He looked torn, his duty to his land warring with his duty to the woman he had imprisoned. "The main barn is ablaze," he said, his voice rough. "The wind is driving the fire toward the tenant cottages. If we do not stop it, half the village will lose their homes before morning." "Go," Clara said, stepping forward, her own fear for him momentarily eclipsing her precarious situation. "You must go to them, Arthur. They need their Duke. I cannot leave you here unguarded," he said, his eyes searching the dark corners of the room as if expecting assassins to materialize from the shadows. "Not with everything that has happened." "I am locked in," Clara reminded him, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "I am going nowhere. Save the farm. The truth can wait until the morning." Arthur hesitated, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles were white. "I have ordered Henderson to stand guard outside this door. He is to admit no one. Absolutely no one, Clara. Do you understand? Not even my mother." "I understand," she nodded. "I will return as soon as the fire is contained," he promised. He looked as if he wanted to say more, perhaps to apologize for the cell he had put her in, or to acknowledge the madness of the night. But the bell clanged again, more urgent this time. "Stay away from the windows." With a final pained look, Arthur slammed the door. Clara heard the key turn again, sealing her in. She heard him giving crisp, shouting orders to Henderson in the hallway, followed by the thundering of his boots fading as he ran toward the stables. Then there was silence, save for the storm. Clara returned to the window, watching the orange glow intensify against the black sky. She knew, with the instinct of a woman who had analyzed every penny of the estate's accounts, that this fire was no accident. The grain was damp from the season. It would not ignite so fiercely on its own. And the timing, just hours after she had been accused, just as the household was paralyzed by scandal, was too precise. It was a diversion, a masterful, brutal diversion designed to strip the house of its protector. She went back to her desk, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the papers she had written, her defense. Then, her eyes fell on the other document, the single page she had torn from the expense ledger days ago, the page detailing the illicit payments to Frederick Vance. She had kept it hidden in the spine of a book on crop rotation, her ultimate insurance. "He is gone," she whispered to herself, and she knows it. Clara did not waste time. She took the ledger page, folded it into a tight, small square, and slipped it inside the stiff bodice of her dress, pushing it down until it rested against her skin, concealed by the heavy boning of her stays. It was a fragile shield, a piece of paper against a hurricane, but it was all she had. 20 minutes passed. The house was unnervingly quiet, drained of its men, who had all rushed to the fire. Then came the sound Clara had been dreading. Not the heavy, respectful tread of Henderson, but the sharp, clicking cadence of heels on stone. The key turned in the lock again. But this time, it was not the swift, decisive turn of Arthur's hand. It was slow, deliberate, savouring the moment. The door opened. Lady Augusta stood on the threshold. She was not dressed for bed. She wore a heavy travelling cloak over her dark gown, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of serene, terrifying triumph. Behind her stood not Henderson, but two burly men Clara did not recognise, rough-looking men in ill-fitting liveries that smelled of the stables and stale ale. "Where is Henderson?" Clara asked, standing her ground by the desk, her hand resting over the place where the evidence lay hidden against her heart. "Henderson has been relieved of his duties for the evening," Augusta said, stepping into the room. She looked around the library with a sneer, as if the very books offended her. "He is an old man. The excitement of the fire was too much for him. He is resting in the scullery." She lifted a folded note between two gloved fingers, the wax impressed with Arthur's seal. Real enough at a glance, and in a house filling with smoke, glances were all anyone had. Augusta had sent Henderson running with it the moment the bells began, insisting the Duke required him at the stables. In the chaos of shouted orders and pounding boots, an old servant did not stop to question a command dressed in authority. "The Duke gave orders," Clara said, her voice cold. "No one was to enter. The Duke is a young man with a sentimental heart and a saviour complex," Augusta replied, closing the distance between them. "He is currently fighting a fire that threatens his precious peasants. He has no time for the petty crimes of a house guest. In fact, before he galloped off to play the hero, he left new instructions with me." "I do not believe you," Clara said. "It matters little what a thief believes." Augusta smiled, and the cruelty of it chilled the room more than the draught from the hallway. "Arthur has realised the impossibility of the situation. To hang an earl's daughter for theft would bring a stain upon this house that would last for generations. The scandal would be unbearable. He cannot prosecute you, Clara, but he cannot look at you either. The sight of you, it disgusts him now, to know that he let a viper into his library, into his confidence. He knows the seal is fake," Clara argued, though her voice wavered. "He sent for Sterling. He said he sent for Sterling to appease you." Augusta lied smoothly. "But why would he drag a respected lawyer all the way from London to defend a woman who pawned family heirlooms to pay her father's gambling debts? No. Arthur has decided to offer you a mercy you do not deserve. He has granted you exile." Augusta snapped her fingers. The two men stepped forward, their shadows falling over Clara. "You are to leave this house immediately," Augusta declared. "A carriage has been prepared. You will be taken away from Suffolk, far away, where your name will not tarnish ours. If you return, if you ever dare to write to him or speak of this night, the mercy ends. The warrant for your arrest will be executed, and you will hang. Do you understand?" "You set the fire," Clara accused, backing away until her hips hit the edge of the heavy oak desk. "You burned your own tenant's livelihood just to get him out of the house." "I did what was necessary to purify this estate," Augusta hissed, her composure cracking for a fraction of a second to reveal the fanaticism beneath. "You are a disease, Clara Vane. You infected my son with your low-born ideas of equality and your accountant's logic. You turned him against his own blood. I am merely cutting out the rot." She nodded to the men. "Take her." "No!" Clara shouted, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from the desk. "I will wait for the Duke. I will not go with you." The first man lunged. Clara swung the candlestick, striking him on the shoulder, but he was twice her size and fueled by Augusta's coin. He wrenched the object from her grip with a brute force that twisted her wrist painfully. The second man grabbed her other arm, pinning her. "Search her," Augusta ordered sharply. "Make sure she hasn't pilfered anything else. We don't want her leaving with the silver spoons." The men patted her down roughly, their hands violating her dignity. Clara held her breath, praying they would not feel the stiff paper hidden beneath the rigid boning of her corset. They checked her pockets, shook out her skirts, but the corset, an armour of whalebone and propriety, kept her secret safe. "She's clean, Your Grace," the man grunted. "Good," Augusta said, turning toward the door. "Get her out of my sight. Use the servants' entrance. I don't want her soiling the main carpet." Clara was dragged from the library, her feet barely touching the ground. She fought, she kicked, she screamed Arthur's name, but the house was empty of allies. The thick stone walls swallowed her cries, and the storm outside drowned out everything else. They hauled her through the narrow, twisting corridors of the servants' wing, past the kitchens where the fires had been raked out, and into the cold, wet courtyard. The carriage waiting there was a nightmare on wheels. It was not one of the Trevelyan coaches with their sprung seats and waterproof lacquers. It was a growler, a dilapidated hackney hire that looked as if it had been dredged from a swamp. The wood was rotting, the leather curtains were tattered, and the horse standing in the traces looked miserable, its head bowed against the rain. "Get in," the man snarled, shoving her toward the open door. "My coat!" Clara gasped, the freezing rain instantly soaking her thin indoor dress. "Please, let me get my coat! I will freeze!" "You should have thought of that before you stole the Duchess's diamonds," the man laughed, pushing her inside with a force that sent her sprawling onto the musty, damp floor of the carriage. The door slammed shut. Clara scrambled to the window, pounding on the cracked glass. She saw Augusta standing under the shelter of the overhang, dry and imperious, watching the scene with the satisfaction of a general who has won a war without drawing a sword. "To the London road!" Augusta shouted to the driver, a hunched figure wrapped in oilskins who looked as unscrupulous as the men who had dragged Clara out. "Drive until the horse is tired, then dump her. I don't care where." The whip cracked. The carriage lurched forward with a groan of protesting wood and rusted metal. Clara was thrown back against the hard horsehair seat as they rattled out of the cobbled courtyard and onto the estate road. The journey was a descent into hell. The suspension of the hackney was non-existent. Every rut, every stone, every pothole in the unpaved road sent a jarring shock through Clara's body. She had no lantern, only the occasional flash of lightning to illuminate the interior of her prison. The roof leaked, sending icy drips of water down her neck and back, soaking the bodice where the ledger page lay hidden. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around herself, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. She was leaving Lowestoft. She was leaving the only place where she had felt a sense of purpose in years. She was leaving Arthur. The thought of him, fighting the fire, believing she was safe in the library, tore at her heart more than the cold. He would return to find her gone. Augusta would tell him she fled. She would say Clara confessed and ran into the night to escape justice. And without Clara there to point out the seal, without her voice to reason with him, would the logic of her flight be the final proof of her guilt? "He will believe I left him," she whispered into the darkness, the tears finally coming, hot and salty against her frozen skin. "He will believe I am a thief." The carriage turned onto the main coastal road, a track that was little more than a river of mud in this weather. The wheels spun and slipped, the carriage sliding dangerously close to the ditches. The driver showed no mercy to the beast pulling them, whipping the horse relentlessly. They were moving away from the estate, away from safety, plunging deeper into the desolate, uninhabited marshlands that lay between Lowestoft and the first coaching inn. Clara tried to think. She tried to summon the cold, hard numbers that usually calmed her mind. £2,500. That debt was still there, looming larger than ever. Now she had no job, no reference, no home, and a reputation that would be shredded by morning. She was not just ruined, she was erased. But as her hand brushed against her chest, she felt the crinkle of the paper, the ledger, the proof. Augusta had been so focused on the sapphires, so intent on the humiliation of the expulsion, that she had forgotten the original sin. She had forgotten that Clara held the receipts of her embezzlement. Clara sat up, wiping the rain and tears from her face. She was freezing, bruised and terrified, but she was not dead, and as long as she breathed, she held the power to destroy the woman who had done this to her. She would not die in this carriage. She would not freeze in a ditch. She would walk to London if she had to. She would find Sterling. She would survive. The carriage hit a deep fissure in the road with a bone-shattering crack. The vehicle listed violently to the left, the wood screaming under the strain. For a moment, it balanced on two wheels, teetering on the edge of disaster, before slamming back down into the muck. The momentum was gone. The horse floundered, trying to pull the dead weight, but the left rear wheel was hopelessly mire-deep in the clay. The driver cursed, a string of foul oaths that were snatched away by the wind. He jumped down, his boots squelching in the mud. He came to the window, his face a grotesque mask in the flash of lightning. "Wheels stuck!" he shouted over the storm. "And the axles cracked. This is as far as you go, Duchess." "You cannot leave me here," Clara cried, looking out at the desolation. There was nothing but reeds and black water for miles. "It is the middle of the marsh. I will die of exposure." "Not my problem," the man spat. "I was paid to drive you off the estate. You're off. Get out." He wrenched the door open. The wind howled into the small space, bringing the smell of salt and rot. "Get out, or I drag you out." Clara stepped down into the mud. It came up to her calves, thick and freezing, sucking at her shoes. The rain was torrential now, a deluge that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of her face. The driver didn't even look at her. He began unhitching the horse, intending to ride it away and leave the carriage, and her, to rot. Clara Vane stood alone in the storm. She was shivering uncontrollably, her dress plastered to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes. She watched the driver mount the horse and splash away into the gloom, leaving her in a silence that was broken only by the thunder. She was 10 miles from Lowestoft, 10 miles from Arthur. She turned her face toward the direction of London, toward the impossibly distant hope of justice. She took a step, dragging her foot from the mud with a gasp of effort. Then another. She was the daughter of Hatherley. She had balanced the books of a bankrupt earldom. She had managed the accounts of a duke. She would not let a little mud be the end of her story. But deep down, as the cold began to numb her fingers and slow her heart, she knew that logic alone could not save her tonight. She needed a miracle, or she needed a man who could look at a broken seal and see the truth. A man who would leave a fire to chase a ghost into the storm. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. "Please, look at the seal." The darkness swallowed her plea, and Lady Clara Vane lowered her head against the gale and began to walk. The first grey fingers of dawn were beginning to claw their way over the eastern horizon, staining the storm-bruised sky with a sickly pallor, when Arthur Trevelyan finally turned his horse back toward Lowestoft Hall. The fire at the home farm was extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the skeletal, blackened remains of the great barn and the heavy, acrid stench of wet ash that clung to the air like a shroud. Arthur's coat was ruined, scorched by embers and soaked by the relentless rain, and his face was smeared with soot and mud. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the reins, but his mind refused to acknowledge the exhaustion. His thoughts were not on the lost grain or the damaged timber. They were entirely fixed on the library and the woman he had locked inside it. The ride back to the hall was a blur of shadows and wind. The storm had broken its fever pitch, settling into a steady, freezing drizzle that turned the estate roads into rivers of slurry. As the silhouette of the manor rose from the mist, dark and uninviting, a strange knot of dread tightened in Arthur's stomach. The house was too quiet. Even at this hour, with the fire at the farm doused, there should have been activity. Grooms waiting for the horses, footmen carrying lanterns. Instead, Lowestoft Hall stood silent and blind, its windows dark save for a single light burning in the dowager's wing. Arthur slid from his saddle in the courtyard, his boots landing heavily in the muck. He tossed the reins to a sleepy stable boy who had emerged from the shadows, rubbing his eyes. "Rub him down well," Arthur ordered, his voice rasping from the smoke. "And keep a fresh mount ready. I may need to ride for the magistrate in the morning." He took the steps to the side entrance 2 at a time, ignoring the protest of his stiff knees. He pushed into the house, the warmth of the interior hitting him not as a comfort, but as a stifling, stagnant wave. The air smelled of old wax and silence. He moved quickly through the servants' corridors, making for the main hall, his boots leaving a trail of ash and mud on the polished floors. Henderson, he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Report! There was no answer. The silence stretched, unnatural and unnerving. Arthur's pace quickened to a run. He reached the main corridor that led to the library, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. He saw the door. It was ajar. The heavy oak door, which he had personally locked and ordered guarded, stood open by a few inches, revealing the darkness within. The chair he had instructed Henderson to occupy outside the room was empty, tipped over on its side as if knocked down in a scuffle. Clara! Arthur breathed, pushing the door wide so hard it slammed against the inner wall. He raised his lantern, the light swinging wildly across the room. The library was empty. The fire in the grate was dead, a pile of cold grey ash. The chair at the desk was pushed back. The room felt abandoned, hollowed out. There was no sign of the woman he had left there. Clara, he shouted, the name tearing from his throat. She is gone, Your Grace. The voice came from the shadows near the doorway. Arthur spun around, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the riding crop he still carried. Henderson stepped into the light. The butler looked old, far older than he had yesterday. His livery was dishevelled, his face pale and drawn, and there was a bruise darkening on his cheekbone. He held himself with a rigid, fragile dignity, but his eyes were filled with a profound shame. Gone? Arthur advanced on him, the lantern shaking in his grip. What do you mean, gone? I gave you an order, Henderson. I told you that no one was to enter or leave this room. Where is she? I could not stop them, Your Grace, Henderson said, his voice trembling. They came while you were fighting the fire. Her Grace, the Dowager. She had men with her. Rough men. Not from the estate. My mother. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, deadly fury. What did she do? She ordered Lady Clara removed, Henderson confessed, looking down at the floor. She said you had authorized it. She said Lady Clara was to be taken away to avoid the scandal. I tried to protest, Your Grace. I told her of your orders. But the men, they shoved me aside. They took the key. Arthur seized the lapels of the butler's coat, hauling the older man forward. Where did they take her, man? Speak. They put her in a growler, Your Grace. One of the hire carriages from the village. Her Grace ordered the driver to take her to the London road. She gave instructions to leave her there. The London road, Arthur repeated, the words sounding senseless. In this storm. She has no money. She has no coat. It is 10 miles of marshland before the first inn. I know, Your Grace, Henderson whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I know. Arthur released him, stepping back as if struck. The horror of it washed over him. He had left Clara in this room to protect her, to keep her safe while he fought a fire that he now realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, had been nothing more than a diversion. He had played the hero for his tenants while his own mother played the executioner for the woman he respected. Where is my mother? Arthur asked, his voice low and terrible. She is in the morning room, Your Grace, waiting for you. Arthur did not wait. He strode out of the library, his fatigue forgotten, replaced by an adrenaline fueled by pure rage. He marched to the morning room and kicked the doors open. Lady Augusta was seated by a roaring fire, sipping tea from a delicate china cup. She looked immaculate, her silver hair perfectly pinned, her black dress crisp and unwrinkled. She looked up as Arthur entered, her expression one of calm, maternal concern that curdled Arthur's blood. Arthur, she said, setting the cup down, you look dreadful. Is the fire out? I was so worried about the smoke reaching the house. Where is she? Arthur demanded, stopping in the centre of the room, dripping water and soot onto the Persian rug. Who? Augusta asked innocently, though her eyes glinted with steel. Oh, you mean the thief? The Vane girl? She is gone, Arthur, and you should be thanking me. Thanking you. Arthur's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You kidnapped a woman under my protection. You violated my direct orders. You sent her out into a storm that could kill her. I sent her away to save you from your own weakness. Augusta stood up, her voice rising to match his. "Do not look at me with that judgment. You were ready to let her stay here, to let her manipulate you with her tears and her lies." She confessed. "Arthur, as soon as you left, she broke down. She admitted she stole the tiara to pay her father's debts. She begged me to let her go before the constable arrived. She fled to avoid the noose. She confessed." Arthur stared at his mother. "Clara Vane is the proudest woman I have ever met. She would never confess to a crime she did not commit. Desperation makes cowards of us all," Augusta scoffed. "She took the easy way out. She is probably halfway to London by now, laughing at how easily she fooled the great Duke of Lowestoft." "You lie," Arthur said. It was a simple statement, but it hung in the air like a blade. "I am your mother," Augusta hissed, stepping closer. "I have protected this family for 40 years. I protected it from your father's indifference, and I am protecting it from your naivety. That girl was a parasite. She stole my sapphires. The proof was in her bed. The receipt was in her name. What more do you need?" "I need the truth," Arthur said, "and I do not believe I will find it in your mouth." He turned on his heel and walked out, ignoring her shouts of indignation. He went back to the library. He needed to think. He needed to silence the roaring in his head and find the thread of logic that Clara had always urged him to follow. "The numbers do not lie," she had said. "Details matter." He entered the empty library again. He walked to the desk where Clara had sat for weeks, the wood worn smooth by her industry. He looked at the inkwell, the stack of ledgers, the quill she had used. He closed his eyes, trying to summon her voice. What had she said in the dining room? What was the detail she had clung to with such desperate certainty? The seal. "Look at the seal, Arthur." She had said the seal on the receipt was fake because it lacked a flaw, a nick on the left petal of the rose. She had claimed she had a letter from Sterling that proved it. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at the desk drawers. They were closed. If she had fled in a panic, if she had confessed and run, would she have taken the letter? Or would she have left it, a silent testament to her innocence? He pulled open the top drawer. It was neat, organized with the precision that defined Clara's mind. There, sitting on top of a stack of blank parchment, was a letter. The paper was high quality, the handwriting cramped and legalistic. Arthur picked it up. His hands, stained with the soot of the fire, shook slightly. He turned the envelope over. On the back, preserved in red wax, was the seal of the Sterling firm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the magnifying glass, the same one he had used in the dining room to condemn her to confinement. He brought the glass down to the wax. He focused on the image of the rose. There it was, clear as day, undeniable and sharp. A small triangular chip on the left petal of the rose, a flaw in the metal of the ring that had transferred perfectly to the wax. Arthur felt the world tilt on its axis. He reached into his inner coat pocket, where he had stowed the forged pawn receipt after the scene in the dining room. He pulled it out, unfolding the creased paper. He placed it side by side with the letter. He moved the magnifying glass to the receipt. The seal on the receipt was smooth, perfect, flawless. It was a forgery. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest. Clara had told the truth, every word. She had been innocent. She had sat in this room, accused by the man she had helped, locked up by the man she had trusted, and she had been right. The receipt was a lie. The theft was a lie. And if the theft was a lie, then the confession his mother claimed was a lie. Arthur looked up from the desk, his eyes burning. He looked at the empty chair. He saw, in his mind's eye, Clara's face as she had looked at him in the dining room. The betrayal, the hurt, the pride. He had failed her. He had failed the logic he prized so much. He had allowed the prejudice of his class and the manipulation of his mother to blind him to the evidence that was right in front of his eyes. She knew. He whispered to the empty room. She knew the seal was fake. That is why she sent her away. Augusta hadn't expelled Clara to save the family from scandal. She had expelled her to prevent the arrival of Lord Sterling. She had kidnapped an innocent woman to cover her own crime. A sound escaped Arthur's throat. A low, guttural roar of pure anguish. He slammed his fist onto the desk, cracking the wood. The pain was grounding, a sharp focus in the chaos. He didn't just feel guilt, he felt terror. Henderson had said they took her to the London road. That was 10 miles of open marsh. The storm had washed out bridges and turned roads into swamps. And Clara had nothing. No money, no shelter, no coat. He had sent her to her death. Arthur spun around and ran. He did not walk. He sprinted through the corridors of Lowestoft Hall, terrifying the maids who were starting to emerge for their morning duties. He burst out into the courtyard again, shouting for the stablemaster. "Saddle Bucephalus!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Now! And bring my heavy cloak!" The stablemaster, a burly man named Thomas, looked at the Duke with wide eyes. "Bucephalus, your grace. He's barely broken. In this mud, he'll be dangerous." "I said saddle him!" Arthur shouted, grabbing the man by the collar. "He is the fastest horse we have, and I need speed, Thomas. I need to ride as if the devil himself is chasing me." Thomas nodded, sensing the madness in his master's eyes. "Aye, your grace, at once." Arthur paced the cobblestones while the great black stallion was brought out. The horse was a beast of muscle and temper, snorting and stamping, its eyes rolling wild. It was a horse for a desperate man. Arthur grabbed the reins, ignoring the animal's attempt to rear. He swung himself into the saddle with a violence that surprised the horse into momentary stillness. "Your grace!" Augusta stood at the top of the steps, wrapped in a shawl, looking down at him. Her face was pale now, the first cracks of fear showing in her mask. She had heard the shouting. She saw the look on his face. "Arthur, where are you going?" she called out, her voice shrill. "You cannot ride out in this. You are the Duke." Arthur gathered the reins, controlling the dancing stallion with thighs of iron. He looked up at his mother, and for the first time in his life, he looked at her with zero affection, zero deference. He looked at her as he would look at a criminal he was sentencing to the gallows. "I am going to retrieve the woman I should never have let you touch," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "And when I return, Mother, you had best pray to whatever God you believe in that she is alive. Because if she is not, if one hair on her head has been harmed by your treachery, you will not only lose your home, you will lose your son. Forever." "She is a nobody," Augusta screamed, losing all control. "She is a pauper. You would risk your life for her." "She is the only person in this house with honor," Arthur replied. "And that makes her worth 1,000 of you." He dug his spurs into Bucephalus's flanks. The horse surged forward like a cannonball, hooves striking sparks from the stones before hitting the mud of the drive. Arthur leaned low over the animal's neck, urging him on, faster, faster. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the risk to his own neck. The wind tore at his face, stinging his eyes, but he kept them wide open, scanning the road ahead. The grey light of dawn was revealing a desolate, flooded landscape. The road to London was a ribbon of sludge winding through the marshes. "Hold on, Clara," he prayed silently, the words a mantra against the rhythm of the galloping hooves. "Hold on, I am coming. I promise you, I am coming." He rode past the ruins of the burned barn, the smell of ash filling his nose again, a reminder of the diversion that had cost him everything. He pushed the horse harder. He had to find the carriage. He had to catch the higher hackney before it reached the crossroads, or before the driver dumped her in the middle of nowhere. Henderson had said, the London road. That was his only clue. Mile after mile flew by. The horse was lathered in sweat, its breath coming in great white plumes. But Arthur showed no mercy. He rode with the desperation of a man who knows he is racing against his own conscience. Every minute that passed was a minute Clara was cold, afraid, and thinking he had abandoned her. That thought was the spur that drove him. She believed he thought her a thief. She believed he had cast her out. He couldn't let that be the last thing she knew. He had to tell her. He had to tell her that he had seen the seal, that he believed her, the thought hung unfinished in his mind, terrifying and true, that he loved her. The realization didn't slow him down. It made him reckless. He took a corner too fast, the horse sliding dangerously in the mud, but Arthur balanced them with sheer will. He regained the centre of the road and galloped on, and then, through the mist and the drizzle, he saw it. About a mile ahead, stuck fast in a deep mire where the road dipped toward the river, was a carriage. It was listing to one side, a dark, broken shape against the grey sky. There was no horse in the traces. The driver was gone. It sat abandoned, a coffin of wood and leather in the middle of the wasteland. Arthur's heart stopped. He spurred Bucephalus into a final, frantic burst of speed. "Clara!" he shouted, though the wind snatched the name away. He closed the distance, his eyes frantically searching the area around the carriage. Was she inside? Had she tried to walk? The mud around the vehicle was churned up, but the rain was washing away tracks as fast as they were made. He reached the carriage, pulling the stallion up so sharply the horse reared, pawing the air. Arthur didn't wait for the animal to settle. He vaulted from the saddle, landing in the knee-deep mud, ruining his boots, ruining his clothes, caring about none of it. He scrambled toward the carriage door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the handle and wrenched it open. "Clara!" The carriage was empty. Arthur stared at the tattered leather seats, empty save for a puddle of water on the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. She wasn't here. The driver had left the carriage, which meant he had taken the horse. Had he taken Clara, or had he left her? Arthur spun around, scanning the horizon. The marsh stretched out in every direction, flat and grey and deadly. If she had tried to walk, then he saw it. A flash of pale colour against the dark earth, about 100 yards down the road, moving slowly, agonizingly, slowly. It was a figure, a small, solitary figure struggling against the wind, walking away from him, walking toward London. Relief buckled his knees for a second, but he forced himself upright. He didn't mount the horse again. He wanted to reach her with his own 2 feet. He wanted to be the one to bridge the distance. "Clara!" he screamed, running through the sludge, his heavy cloak billowing behind him like black wings. The figure stopped. She turned slowly, swaying slightly in the wind. Even from this distance, he could see she was soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her, her hair a wet tangle. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had commanded his library, but she was standing. She was alive. Arthur ran harder, his lungs burning. He closed the gap, the distance between them shrinking until he could see the shock on her face, the disbelief in her green eyes. He could see the shiver that racked her body. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, breathing hard, the steam rising from his overheated body in the cold air. They stood there for a moment in the middle of the desolation, the Duke and the outcast, the mud covering them both. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her lips blue with cold. Arthur didn't speak. He couldn't. The logic, the words, the apologies, they all died in his throat. He did the only thing that felt true. He unclasped his heavy fur-lined cloak and swung it around her shivering shoulders, wrapping her in his warmth, shielding her from the storm he had sent her into. He looked down at her, his blue eyes fierce and wet, not with rain, but with tears he refused to let fall. "I should have believed you the moment you showed me the nick in the rose," he choked out. "I made you pay for my doubt." Clara looked up at him, and then her legs gave way. Arthur caught her before she hit the mud, pulling her against his chest, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his entire estate, the only treasure that truly mattered. He buried his face in her wet hair, breathing in the scent of rain and resilience. "I have you," he murmured into her hair. "I have you, Clara, and I am never letting you go again." The storm raged on around them, but for the first time in days, the chaos didn't matter. Arthur Trevelyan had found the truth, and he held it in his arms. Now, the only thing left to do was to bring her home and burn down the lies that had tried to destroy them. The ride back to Lowestoft would be slow, but it would be the most important journey of his life. The wind on the Suffolk marshes did not simply blow, it scoured. It stripped the heat from the blood and the hope from the soul, leaving nothing but a raw, aching numbness. But as Arthur Trevelyan wrapped his heavy, wool-lined cloak around Clara's trembling shoulders, the biting cold of the storm seemed to recoil for the first time that night. He held her there in the middle of the road, his boots sinking deep into the slurry of mud, his arms forming a fortress against the desolate landscape. Clara could barely feel her own feet. The sensation of his warmth seeping into her frozen skin was so intense it almost burned. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by rain and exhaustion, trying to reconcile the image of the furious, soot-stained man before her with the distant, logical Duke who had locked her in the library. You saw the seal?" she repeated, her voice cracking, a jagged whisper lost in the gale. "I saw it," Arthur confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled the hood of the cloak up over her wet, matted hair, shielding her face from the driving rain. "I found the letter in your desk. I compared it to the receipt. The flaw in the wax was exactly as you described. The receipt is a forgery, Clara. A lie. And the woman who presented it is a liar." Clara slumped against him, the adrenaline that had kept her walking finally abandoning her. "She told me you ordered it," she sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "She said you wanted me gone to avoid the scandal. She said you were disgusted by me." "Disgusted?" Arthur pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes with a ferocity that stopped her breath. "Clara, look at me. I rode a half-broken stallion through a flood to find you. I left my home burning, truly burning, to find you. Does that look like disgust?" "But the fire," Clara stammered, her teeth chattering violently. "The barn. A diversion," Arthur spat the word, looking over his shoulder at the dark horizon. "She set it, or she had it set. She knew I would never leave the house while you were under guard unless the estate itself was threatened. She played on my duty to remove me from your side. And like a fool, I fell for it. I left you alone with a wolf because I was too busy trying to be a shepherd." He looked back at her, his expression softening into a profound sorrow. "I failed you, Clara. I prized logic above faith. I demanded proof when I should have trusted the character of the woman standing before me. I locked you in a room when I should have been standing at the door with a sword. You are here now," Clara whispered, her hand finding the lapel of his ruined coat. "That is not enough," Arthur said. He stepped back, releasing her for a fraction of a second, only to do something that defied every rule of his station and the sanity of the situation. There, in the middle of the flooding road, with the mud reaching his calves and the rain lashing down like a judgment, the Duke of Lowestoft dropped to one knee. He did not care about the muck ruining his breeches. He did not care about the indignity. He took Clara's freezing, mud-caked hands in his own. "Arthur, get up," Clara cried, shocked. "You are ruining your clothes." "My clothes are meaningless," he said, his voice rising above the wind. "My title is meaningless if it cannot protect the people I value. Clara Vane, you have been humiliated, accused, and cast out. You have been treated as a criminal and a beggar. I cannot erase the last 12 hours. I cannot undo the cold you have suffered, but I can ensure that it never happens again." He squeezed her hands, his blue eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "I am not asking you to return to Lowestoft Hall as my employee," he declared. "I will not have you go back to that library to count my coin while the servants whisper. I am asking you to return as its mistress. I am asking you to marry me." The world seemed to stop spinning. The storm roared on, but Clara heard only the pounding of her own heart. "Marry you?" she breathed. "Arthur, this is madness. We are standing in a bog. I am a bankrupt Earl's daughter with a ruined reputation. Your mother, my mother has forfeited her right to an opinion." Arthur cut in sharply. "She tried to destroy you because she feared you. She feared your mind, your strength, and your influence over me. She wanted to banish you to the shadows. So I will bring you back in the brightest light I can command. If you are my Duchess, her lies become treason. If you are my wife, no one in England will dare to question your honour. Do not offer me marriage as a shield, Arthur," Clara said, pulling her hands back slightly, her pride flaring even in her weakness. "I will not be a charity case. I will not be a wife taken out of guilt." "Guilt?" Arthur laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humour. He stood up, towering over her again, and cupped her face in his hands. "Do you think I rode 10 miles in this hell out of guilt? I rode because the thought of a world without you in it was more terrifying than the fire. I rode because you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen the man, not the title. I love you, Clara. I have loved you since you corrected my math in the library, and I was too stupid to realize it until I saw your empty chair." Clara looked at him, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she found only the raw, naked truth. The man who valued logic above all else had abandoned it for her. "I come with nothing, Arthur," she whispered, her resistance crumbling. "I have a debt of £2,500. I have a mother who needs a home. I have nothing to offer you but your mind," Arthur finished. "Your courage, your soul. That is all I require. As for the debt, consider it settled. Lord Stirling will have his cheque before the sun sets tomorrow. Your mother will have the dower house, the one my mother is currently vacating, whether she knows it or not." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, sharing his heat. "Say yes, Clara. Let me take you home." "Yes," she breathed, the word carried away by the wind, but he heard it. "Yes." Arthur wasted no more time. He turned and whistled for Bucephalus. The great black stallion, who had been waiting restlessly a few yards away, trotted over, his coat sleek with rain and sweat. "He is dangerous," Clara warned, eyeing the beast. "He is spirited," Arthur corrected, "but he will carry us." He lifted Clara as if she weighed nothing. She was so cold, her limbs stiff, that she could barely help him. He placed her sideways on the saddle, then swung himself up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, enveloping her completely in the cloak so that she was cocooned against him. "Lean into me," he commanded. "Take my heat." He gathered the reins, and they began the slow, treacherous journey back. They could not gallop now. The extra weight and the worsening mud made speed impossible. The horse picked its way through the sludge, head bowed against the gale. The ride was a strange, suspended agony. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, the exhaustion pulling at her like a tide. But every time she shivered, Arthur's arms tightened around her. He spoke to her constantly, his voice a low rumble against her ear, keeping her tethered to the waking world. "We are passing the old mill now," he said. "Do you remember the map? You pointed out the drainage flaw in the mill stream. The water is flowing clear today, despite the storm. Because of you." "My papers," Clara mumbled, her mind drifting to the evidence she still carried. "I have the ledger page." "What?" Arthur asked, leaning closer. "In my bodice," she whispered, her hand moving feebly to her chest. "I tore the page, the payments to Vance. I hid it. I thought I would need to prove it to Stirling myself." Arthur went still for a moment, the reins slackening in his hands. "You carried the proof of my mother's theft with you, even when they were dragging you out." "I couldn't let her win," Clara said simply. Arthur let out a breath that shook with suppressed rage. "She searched you, didn't she? Henderson said she had those men handle you." "She didn't find it," Clara said. "She was too worried about the sapphires." "God!" Arthur groaned, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Every time I think I understand the depth of her malice, the floor drops further. She stripped you, she threw you out, and yet you still protected the truth of my estate." "It is our estate now," she murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes," Arthur vowed. "It is." The miles dragged on. The grey dawn brightened into a dreary, washed-out morning. The rain lightened to a drizzle, though the wind remained fierce. By the time they reached the boundaries of Lowestoft Park, Clara was barely conscious. The cold had settled deep in her bones, a numbness that made her fingers and toes feel like foreign objects. "Stay with me, Clara," Arthur urged, sensing her fading. "We are at the gates. Look, the lions." Clara forced her eyes open. Through the mist, she saw the stone lions guarding the entrance to the drive. They looked less intimidating now, more like sentinels welcoming her home. They rode up the long gravel drive. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent no more. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The servants were awake. The front door stood open, a figure pacing anxiously on the portico. It was Henderson. The old butler had clearly disobeyed whatever orders Augusta had given him to stay away. He was waiting. When he saw the black horse emerge from the fog, carrying two figures, he actually ran down the steps, heedless of the rain. Arthur pulled Bucephalus to a halt at the foot of the stairs. The horse blew hard, its sides heaving, steam rising from its flanks in a cloud. "Your Grace!" Henderson cried, his voice cracking with relief. "You found her! Praise be to God!" "Help me!" Arthur commanded, his voice hoarse. He slid from the saddle first, his legs nearly buckling from the stiffness of the ride. He reached up and took Clara into his arms. She slid down into his embrace, her legs refusing to hold her weight. She was a ruin of mud and wet wool, her face pale as death, her lips violet. "Get the fire in the blue room built up to a roar," Arthur ordered, carrying her up the steps. "Get Mrs. Gable. I want hot bricks, blankets, and broth. Immediately." "The Dowager," Henderson began, glancing nervously toward the interior of the hall. "The Dowager is not the mistress of this house," Arthur snarled, stepping over the threshold. "If she attempts to interfere, you are to lock her in her chambers. Do I make myself clear?" "Abundantly, Your Grace," Henderson said, a spark of vindication in his old eyes. Arthur carried Clara through the main hall. The few maids, who were scrubbing the floors, stopped and stared, mouths agape. They saw their Duke, usually the picture of immaculate grooming, covered in muck, his hair wild, carrying the disgraced Lady Clara like a fallen soldier. He did not stop. He climbed the grand staircase, his boots leaving muddy prints on the carpet that Augusta prized so dearly. He walked past the portraits of his ancestors, who seemed to watch with silent approval as he carried the future Duchess of Lowestoft to safety. He brought her to the blue room, the room from which she had been accused. He kicked the door open. The fire was already lit. Henderson having anticipated the need, Arthur laid her gently on the bed, on top of the velvet coverlet. He began to unfasten the wet, heavy cloak. Clara shivered violently, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. "Mrs. Gable is coming," Arthur said, chafing her hands between his. "You are safe, Clara. You are warm." He reached for the laces of her boots, struggling with the wet leather knots. He pulled the sodden boots from her feet and tossed them into the corner. He stripped the wet socks from her frozen toes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, bustled in a moment later, followed by two maids carrying piles of blankets and a steaming basin. She was a stern woman, but when she saw Clara's condition, her face softened into pure, maternal concern. "Oh, the poor lamb," Mrs. Gable clucked. "Out in that storm all night. It's a miracle she's alive." She looked at Arthur. "Your Grace, you must go. You are soaking wet yourself. You will catch your death." "I am not leaving her," Arthur said, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Clara's hand. "You cannot help her if you are shivering," Mrs. Gable said firmly. "Go and change, Your Grace. I will strip her of these wet things and get her into a warmed nightgown. I promise you, I will not leave her side until you return." Arthur looked at Clara. Her eyes were fluttering closed. He squeezed her hand one last time. "I will be back in 10 minutes, he promised her. "And then we will finish this." He stood up, looking at Mrs. Gable. "Keep the door locked. Admit no one but me." "Understood, sir." Arthur walked out of the room, his body aching, his mind racing. He went to his own chambers, tearing off his ruined clothes with savage movements. He washed the soot and mud from his face and hands, the water turning black in the basin. He dressed quickly, not in the silks of a courtier, but in the severe black coat and breeches of a magistrate. He was no longer just a son or a lover. He was the executioner. He checked the pocket of his discarded coat and retrieved the two documents, the forged receipt and the letter from Sterling. He placed them in his breast pocket. He returned to the blue room exactly 10 minutes later. Clara was sitting up in bed, propped by pillows, wearing a thick flannel nightgown. Her hair had been dried and braided. Her colour was still pale, but the violet tint had left her lips. She held a mug of broth in her hands, the steam warming her face. Mrs. Gable curtsied and left silently as Arthur entered. He pulled a chair close to the bed. "How do you feel?" "Like I have been trampled by a horse." Clara managed a weak smile. "But warm. Finally warm." "Good," Arthur said. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "Because you will need your strength. I intend to end this today. I will not let you sleep under the same roof as that woman while this accusation still stands." "What will you do?" Clara asked, her eyes darkening. "I will hold court," Arthur said grimly. "Here, in the hall. I have sent a rider to fetch the village constable, not to arrest you but to witness, and I have sent for my mother." "She will deny it," Clara warned. "She will say I forged the letter from Sterling." "Let her try," Arthur said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled page Clara had given him on the road, the ledger page with the payments to Vance. "We have the seal, but we also have this. You carried the nail for her coffin in your bodice, Clara. Today, we hammer it in." He stood up, looking toward the door. The storm outside had passed, leaving a strange, suspended silence over the estate. But inside Lowestoft Hall, the true storm was about to break. "Rest for an hour," Arthur commanded softly. "Then dress. Put on your blue silk, the one she mocked. Wear it like armor. When you come down those stairs, I want you to look like the Duchess you are about to become." Clara nodded, a fierce light returning to her green eyes. The victim who had been dragged out into the mud was gone. In her place sat a woman who had survived the fire and the flood, and who was ready to claim her life back. "I will be ready," she said. Arthur turned and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. "I love you, Clara." "And I you, Arthur." He left the room, his footsteps heavy and purposeful on the hardwood. He was going to the great hall to prepare the stage. He would set the chairs. He would place the evidence on the table. And he would wait for his mother to descend, unaware that the son she thought she could manipulate had returned from the wild, not as a boy, but as a king who had found his queen. The great hall of Lowestoft Hall was a space designed to intimidate. For centuries, the Dukes of Lowestoft had held court beneath its vaulted timber ceiling, dispensing justice to tenants and passing judgment on poachers. The stone walls were hung with tapestries depicting battles won and treaties signed, silent witnesses to the power of the Trevelyan line. But on this morning, the air in the hall was heavier than it had been for generations. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt brittle, as if the very foundations of the house were holding their breath. Arthur Trevelyan stood at the head of the long oak table that had been dragged into the centre of the room. He was dressed in black, a stark contrast to the pale morning light streaming through the high windows. His face was set in stone, his blue eyes cold and unyielding. Beside him stood the village constable, a man named Mr. Barrow, who looked uncomfortable to be summoned to the great house for a matter involving the family itself. Behind them, lined up against the wall, were the senior staff, Henderson the butler, Mrs. Gable the housekeeper, and the head groom. They stood with their hands clasped and their heads bowed, but their eyes darted nervously toward the grand staircase. "She is coming, Your Grace," Henderson whispered, the sound echoing in the vast space. Arthur did not turn. His gaze was fixed on the top of the stairs, where Lady Clara Vane had just appeared. She wore the blue silk dress, the same dress she had worn on her first day, the same dress Lady Augusta had mocked for its faded hems. But there was nothing faded about the woman wearing it now. Clara descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace. Her hair was swept back in a severe, elegant knot, revealing the pale curve of her neck. Her face was still pale from the ordeal of the night, but her green eyes burned with a fire that no rainstorm could extinguish. She did not look like a victim who had been dragged through the mud. She looked like a queen approaching her throne. Arthur moved to the foot of the stairs, offering his hand. Clara took it, her fingers cool but steady. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. I have nothing left to fear, Arthur, she replied, her gaze locking with his. The truth is a powerful shield. Then let us wield it, he said. He led her to the chair at his right hand. Clara sat, her spine straight, her hands folded over the ledger page she had retrieved from her bodice. A moment later, the doors to the private wing opened. Lady Augusta swept into the hall. She was dressed in impeccable mourning black, a choice clearly intended to evoke sympathy and authority. She walked with her chin high, her expression one of aggrieved dignity. She looked at the constable, then at the servants, and finally at Arthur and Clara. Her lip curled in a sneer of distaste. "This is a farce, Arthur," she announced, her voice ringing clear. "I am the Dowager Duchess of Lowestoft. I do not answer to a village constable, and I certainly do not sit in judgment with a thief." "You will sit," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute command. "Or you will be made to sit." Augusta faltered, shock registering in her eyes. She had never heard her son speak to her with such open hostility. She walked to the chair opposite Clara and sat, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "Very well," she said, lifting her chin. "Let us get this over with. I assume you have brought the girl back to confess formally before she is sent away again. Though why you felt the need to drag these people into a family matter is beyond me. We are here to establish the facts of the theft of the Trevelyan sapphires," Arthur stated, placing his hands on the table. "A crime was committed in this house. Justice requires a culprit. We have the culprit," Augusta gestured dismissively at Clara. "The jewels were found in her bed. The receipt was in her name. The matter is closed." "The receipt," Arthur repeated. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the crumpled piece of paper that had damned Clara only the night before. He smoothed it out on the wood. Beside it, he placed the letter from Lord Stirling that he had taken from Clara's desk. "Constable Barrow," Arthur said. "Please step forward." The constable approached, clutching his hat. "You are a man of the law," Arthur said. "You are trained to notice details. I want you to examine these two seals. One is from a letter received last week. The other is from the pawn receipt dated 3 days ago. Tell me what you see." Barrow leaned over the table, squinting. Arthur handed him the magnifying glass. The constable peered through it, moving back and forth between the two red wax impressions. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Augusta shifted in her chair, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Well," Barrow said slowly, straightening up. "They look alike, Your Grace. But this one here, on the letter, the rose has a chip in it, a little triangle missing from the petal. The one on the receipt, it's smooth, perfect-like." "Exactly," Arthur said. He turned his gaze to his mother. "Lord Stirling broke his signet ring 3 months ago. Every document he has sealed since then bears that flaw. The receipt, however, bears the impression of the old ring, a ring that no longer exists in his possession, which means the receipt was forged using a mould taken from an old document." Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And the only person with access to the Hatherley archives, other than Clara, is the mistress of this house." "This is preposterous," Augusta scoffed, though her face had paled. "You are basing this on a scratch in some wax. The girl is a manipulator, Arthur. She probably forged the letter herself to create this confusion. She forged a letter from her own lawyer, predicting that you would frame her with a fake receipt weeks later." Arthur asked incredulously. "That is not manipulation, Mother. That is clairvoyance." "I did not frame her," Augusta shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "I am protecting this family. She is a bankrupt nobody who came here to bleed us dry." "Speaking of bleeding us dry," Arthur said, his voice turning icy. He nodded to Clara. Clara unfolded the single page of the ledger she had carried next to her skin through the storm. She placed it in the center of the table. The ink was slightly smudged from the damp, but the figures were legible. The columns of payments to Westridge, the transfers to Frederick Vance, and the authorizations, initialed in a spidery, arrogant hand. "What is this?" Augusta whispered. staring at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "This," Clara said, her voice steady and calm, "is the record of £12,000 stolen from the Lowestoft estate over the last 5 years. Money diverted to your cousin, Frederick Vance, to pay for his gambling debts. Money that should have fixed the sluice gates and fed the tenants." Augusta recoiled, pressing herself against the back of her chair. The servants against the wall gasped. Henderson's eyes went wide. Theft from the estate was not just a crime, it was a betrayal of the land itself. "You speak of thieves, Mother," Arthur said, standing up. He looked immense, a tower of judgment. "You accuse this woman of stealing a tiara worth £2,000, a crime she did not commit. Yet here is the proof that you have stolen 6 times that amount from your own son. You set a fire to distract me. You kidnapped an innocent woman and sent her out to die in a storm to cover your own crimes. You are not the victim here. You are the villain." "I did it for the family name," Augusta cried, her composure shattering. Tears of rage streaming down her face. "Frederick is blood. We do not let our own fall into ruin. I did what I had to do to maintain our standing. And you would choose this accountant over your own mother." "I choose honour," Arthur said, "something you clearly forgot long ago." He picked up the ledger page and handed it to the constable. "Keep this as evidence, Barrow, but there will be no arrest today." "Arthur," Augusta looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. "I will not have the Duchess of Lowestoft dragged away in irons," Arthur said coldly. "The scandal would hurt the estate, and I have spent enough time cleaning up your messes. But do not mistake my mercy for forgiveness." He walked around the table until he stood directly over her. "You are stripped of every privilege you have claimed as Dowager Duchess, effective immediately. You are stripped of your allowance. You are stripped of your authority over this house." You cannot do that," Augusta whispered. "I can and I have," Arthur replied. "A carriage is waiting in the courtyard. Not a hire hackney, because I am not cruel, but it will take you to Cornwall, to the old dower house at Trevose Head." "Cornwall," Augusta gasped. "But it is desolate. It is hundreds of miles from London. There is no society there. It is a prison." "It is a roof over your head and food on your table," Arthur said, "which is more than you offered Clara last night. You will live there on a stipend sufficient for your needs, but not for your vanity. Frederick Vance has been cut off. If he approaches you or if you attempt to send him money, your stipend ends and you will be destitute." "Arthur, please," Augusta begged, reaching for his hand. "I am your mother." Arthur pulled his hand away. "You ceased to be my mother the moment you sent the woman I love to die in a ditch. Go, before I change my mind and let Barrow do his job." Augusta looked around the room. She saw the condemnation in Henderson's eyes. She saw the pity in Mrs. Gable's face. And she saw Clara sitting calm and untouched, the blue silk shining like a victory banner. Augusta stood up, gathering her dignity in ragged shreds around her. She did not look at Clara. She walked to the door, her head high, but her step was heavy. She was a woman who had played a game of power all her life, and she had lost everything on the turn of a single card. The heavy doors closed behind her with a final echoing boom. A long silence filled the hall. Then Arthur turned to the staff. "You are dismissed," he said gently. "Thank you for your loyalty." The servants bowed low, lower than they had ever bowed before, and filed out. Henderson paused at the door, looked at Clara, and gave her a nod of profound respect before closing the doors. Arthur and Clara were alone. The tension that had held the room together dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. Arthur walked back to Clara and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "It is done," he said. "She is your mother, Arthur," Clara said softly. "Will you regret it?" "I regret that it was necessary," he replied, "but I do not regret the justice of it. A house cannot stand if the foundation is rotten." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a bank draft. He placed it in her hand. "This is for Lord Stirling," he said. £2,500. Clara looked at the check. It was the freedom she had fought for, the salvation of her mother. Tears pricked her eyes. Arthur, I cannot take this. It looks like payment. It is payment, Arthur said firmly. Payment for the months of work you did saving my estate. Payment for the £12,000 you uncovered. Payment for the drainage system that saved the harvest. You earned this, Clara. Every penny. It is not charity. It is your wage. He paused, his thumb brushing her cheek. But there is one more thing. I have sent instructions to the steward at the local dower house, the one on the edge of the park, here in Suffolk. It is being prepared for a new tenant. I thought perhaps the Countess of Hatherley might find the climate agreeable. Clara stared at him. You are bringing my mother here? I am bringing her home, Arthur corrected. I want her close, because I want you close, and I do not want you to ever have to choose between your duty to her and your life with me. Clara dropped the check and threw her arms around his neck. She buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing the last of her grief away. Arthur held her tight, his own eyes wet. They stayed like that for a long time, the Duke and his accountant, bound together not by rank, but by the scars they shared and the truth they had fought for. Epilogue. 6 months later, the library of Lowestoft Hall was bathed in the warm, golden light of a spring afternoon. The windows, once lashed by storm and rain, now stood open to the gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming hawthorn and the distant salt of the sea. Clara sat at the great mahogany desk. She was not wearing faded silk or mended wool. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, the fabric rich and new, but her fingers were still stained with ink. The ledgers of the estate were spread out before her, but they were no longer chaotic messes of deception. They were orderly, precise, and prosperous. The wool yields are up 15%, she murmured, tracing a column with her finger. And the new schoolhouse in the village came in under budget. You are relentless, Your Grace, a voice said from the doorway. Clara looked up, a smile lighting her face. Arthur stood there, leaning against the frame. He looked younger, the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders. He walked into the room and came to stand behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. Most duchesses spend their afternoons painting watercolours or gossiping, he teased, kissing the top of her head. Most duchesses do not have a husband who insists on building new cottages for every tenant family, Clara countered, leaning back into his touch. Someone has to make sure we can afford your philanthropy, Arthur. We can afford it, he said, his arms sliding around her to rest on the desk, encircling her. Thanks to you. He looked down at the ledger, at the neat, uncompromising numbers that told the story of their life. It was a story of hard work, of logic, and of honesty. Do you ever miss it? Arthur asked suddenly, his voice serious. The quiet? Before the scandal? Before you were her grace? Clara looked out the window. She saw the green fields stretching to the sea. She saw the roof of the dower house in the distance, where her mother was currently taking tea with the vicar. She thought of the cold mud of the road and the warmth of Arthur's cloak. I miss nothing, she said, turning in her chair to face him. I was invisible then, Arthur. A ghost in my own life. You saw me. You were the only one who saw me. I saw you, Arthur agreed, pulling her up from the chair and into his arms. And I have never looked away since. He kissed her, deep and slow, a kiss that tasted of promise and peace. The ledgers lay open on the desk, the numbers balanced, the debts paid. The past was a closed book, exiled to a distant coast. Here, in the heart of Lowestoft Hall, the future was being written, not in ink, but in the enduring, unbreakable language of love.